It's a freezing cold day in January, but the sun is out and I'm in a fantastically interesting and actually somewhat unique place. This is Dunham Bridge, where the A57 road from Manchester to Sheffield to Lincoln crosses the River Trent, England's longest river. And it's extremely unusual because you have to pay a toll to cross the river here. And we're going to today look into the history of this crossing of the river, find out about the toll bridge company and actually how people used to cross the river here hundreds of years ago. Well, while we're on our way to investigate the importance of this crossing place, this pontoon that I'm standing on is a reminder of some of the problems that people had crossing the river here, because the level of water in the river changed enormously during the course of the year for two reasons. One of which is that the Trent at this point is tidal, and the second reason is that in winter and springtime, volumes of water coming down it rose enormously. So as you can see, the modern solution here is to have a floating pontoon, but not so easy in days gone by. So we're going to go up to the hilltop and we'll be able to see this unique setting from a slightly different angle. Well, we've come up onto a local place called Newton Cliffs. It's actually on top of a low ridge of sandstone that runs across this region. And so unusual, in fact, that the Romans had a vexillation fortress here in the 1st century. So an important place for them. But the challenge for the Romans and for later generations was how to cross the River Trent. Not so much because the river itself was a problem, but the floodplain either side of it was a major challenge. How did you get to the river without getting hopelessly bogged down in it? And although the Romans chose to cross at other locations, here it was possible to get reasonably close to the river. Particularly on the Newton side, you could get to within a couple of 100 yards of the river on relatively high dry ground. On the Dunham side, it was about half a mile from the riverbank to better soil. And so this became a place where you could cross by ferry, probably from medieval times or before. But it was always the case that either side you could get floods. And in fact, the village of Dunham has often flooded, and on other occasions, the road across here has been cut off by floodwaters as well. So a good place to cross, but far from perfect. Of course, the early history of the Dunham ferry is obscured in history. We really know little about when it first happened. But the first time that Dunham comes into history was in the year 679, when the body of the Saint St Oswald was brought along the Trent on part of the route to take him to Bardney Abbey. And he was unloaded at the wharf in Dunham and then taken overland via Lincoln to there, which is perhaps why Dunham Church is called St Oswald's Church. It was built on a slight rise of higher ground, just about as close to the River Trent as it was possible to be. And a small village grew around it. But this was a village that was always troubled by flooding. It's been flooded many occasions, including, of course, famously in 1947. And that led to a very strange incident in 1795, a year actually of catastrophic flood and ice. And in the year 1795, this church was badly damaged by ice flows in the Trent Valley. I can't think of any other church in England that has suffered such a fate. Only a few years later, it had to be substantially rebuilt again because of flood damage. So this has always been a place that's at risk from the Trent. To be safe, you really need to go another half mile further into Nottinghamshire. So you might say, well, if even the church flooded regularly and the village got inundated several years in a row sometimes, how on earth did people get from the higher ground across the floodplain to the Dunham ferry at all? And the answer to that is that the medieval villagers of Dunham were expected to build a causeway. They were expected to gather stone and raise a route for a road across the watery fields to the river. And so as we walk along here, the modern A57, we're still following the line of where the villagers built their causeway. And in fact, in the 1300s, were once fined for not doing so. And as we get closer to the ferry, we'll see where the road diverges now to the new bridge. Well, I've walked about 300 or 400 yards along the route of the medieval causeway, a bit noisy on the modern A57, it must be said. And then we come to a split in the road. And what I'm standing on is the old medieval causeway leading down to Dunham Ferry. Just to my left is actually the modern road, which diverges slightly off it, taking it onto Dunham Bridge. And from here, I can quite clearly look across the fields and I can see that medieval people put us 3 or 4 feet above the field level. Unfortunately, I don't think it was ever quite enough to guarantee that there was never any flood. Well, we've walked along the causeway and we've come to the place where it ends, right down now on the bank of the River Trent. And it was from here that you could get on the boat to take you across to the other side. A route that had existed for many, many hundreds of years. It was the responsibility of the Lord of the Manor of Dunham to provide a ferryman and a ferry boat pretty well any time of day or night, and in exchange for that, the Lord of the Manor collected the revenues. There was probably a wooden jetty here that you could use, and then something similar on the Newton bank. Things began to change though in 1765 when a turnpike toll road was open from Markham Moor on the Great North Road to Dunham, and then on the other side on to Lincoln. So more travellers started to come this way, and the old ferry was rather inadequate perhaps. Well, one of the most famous people to cross the Dunham ferry was the poet Robert Southey, who came here in 1805 as part of a project of travelling around England while pretending to be a Spanish nobleman. It must be said that by the time he got here, he was not in the best of moods, partly because he stopped at Markham Moor, was ripped off for the cost of a charge to get to Lincoln, and then actually the sheds that he'd been using crashed into a dyke and nearly killed him just a couple of miles up the road. So this is what Southey wrote about his experience here. We came presently to Dunham Ferry. The interruption and expense of crossing here were well compensated by the beauty of the scene. The Trent at this place is the largest fresh water I have seen in England. 2 of its huge arms, which embraced a long island, met just above the ferry like 2 large rivers. The opposite bank was high and broken. The island terminated in a sharp point to which the stream had worn it, and at this point were a score or 25 remarkable willow trees as tall as elms. Some man of taste must have planted them 2 centuries ago. The rest of the island, as far as we could see, was fine meadowland and a colony of rooks had established their commonwealth in the trees. The country up the river was dead flat, with a handsome church in the distance and another on the shore which we were leaving. Many little islands with a bush or 2 upon them in the stream below. The price of the ferry was ½ a crown, which we thought exorbitantly dear. So a nice trip, but expensive for the distance. Well, we've been over on the other side at Dunham, looking at where the ferry set sail across the River Trent. And now we've walked across, using the bridge in fact, of course, to the Newton-on-Trent side, the Lincolnshire side. And for centuries, there probably would have been just a wooden wharf here for the ferry boat to tie up at. But in 1790, the Industrial Revolution came to the River Trent. The Trent Navigation Company was formed to try to improve the navigation, and they built a lot of new facilities. One of the things that they built was what they called a hailing path, a special path for horses all the way along the river. And they also built a small number of docks where boats could unload and where they could develop the local trade. And here we can see both these things at this place, because this was the entrance to one of the docks that they built. And if we'd been here in the 1820s or so, probably this would have been full of small river craft loading from the local bone mill, perhaps bringing in coal. All sorts of things would have been going on here. But the Trent Navigation created this dock. The boats came in, the ferry boat would be able to use it, and they had to construct a bridge for the horses hauling the barges up and down the river. So we get this sort of 18th century scene. Of course, now it's been filled in and it's actually used as a car park for fishermen, so nothing like what it would have been. But it was important enough to have a man who was based here who was the dock master. We should remember it wasn't an easy job. There were dangers with the river. And in 1924, the young son of the master here fell into the Trent and he tried to rescue his son. Sadly, he waded into the river, fell into what they call a gravel hole, a hidden depth, and was swept away and drowned. So you can see that river life was far from safe in those days. So by the 1790s, turnpike roads had been opened connecting Markham Moor with Dunham-on-Trent and on to Lincoln, and people were starting to talk about building a bridge to replace the ferry. The Dunham-on-Trent Act was passed in 1790, and they brought in a Leeds engineer to help design a bridge of 4 iron arches on stone pillars, built for about £18,000. Remarkably, constructed in a period of only 14 months, which you'd have struggled to get done today, to be honest. It was believed that this would revitalise the village of Dunham-on-Trent, and it would become a market town as travellers stopped to peruse the wares that farmers brought in. Sadly, that never really happened. And the bridge settled down into an interesting, if sometimes controversial, history. Well, you can see behind me what they rather romantically call Dunham Toll Plaza, where people stop to pay their 40p or whatever. Every day, all night, apart from Christmas Day and this year Boxing Day, when I was able to drive across for free. But the paying of the toll here has actually caused some interesting legal cases over the years, several of which are connected to a rather odd clause in the original Act, which said that you only had to pay a toll once per day, which was clearly intended to help the local farmers. So if we go back to 1871, there was a huge legal row when one of the local farmers objected to being asked to pay his toll of 1 penny for a second time. For 40 years, it had been the given practice that people could walk over the bridge several times a day and only pay a toll once. But in May 1871, William Cockett was suddenly asked to pay an extra penny. Well, he didn't want to. So he took the case to the justices, a case that went on for many months of argument until at the end of the case, he lost his case. So it was quite an expensive message for him. In 1883, a traction engine company tried the same trick, taking the toll bridge company to court, but the toll bridge company argued that actually they'd used the engine once for themselves and once for somebody else, and that was cheating, and so they lost as well. But perhaps my favourite example of somebody trying to beat the toll was a Kettleborough school teacher in the great days when cycling was a first craze, and he thought he could save the twopenny charge for taking a bicycle across the bridge by getting off and wheeling it across while he was on foot. Sadly, he lost that case as well, and he also had to pay the judge's first-class travel expenses to hear the case. So that was a very expensive defeat. My suggestion, pay your toll without arguing. Well, you don't need to be an expert in engineering to see that this bridge here is not the same one as in the old photographs. And of course what happened was modern life overtook George Lever's original bridge. Lorries got heavier, traffic volumes increased, and the old cast iron structure was no longer adequate. So by the 1970s, plans were afoot to replace the original Dunham Bridge. But when the new one was opened in 1978, it was done in a very interesting way. So I'm going to go underneath Dunham Bridge now to see what they actually did. Well, when you come down underneath Dunham Bridge, you find something really interesting about how they built the new bridge. Here is the original stonework, part of George Lever's design from early 19th century, Georgian Britain. But here is the 1970s steelwork that's been attached to it as part of the strengthening of the bridge. So we've got old and new in one place, making this a remarkably interesting location. So I hope you've enjoyed our visit to Dunham Bridge, this important crossing of the River Trent. People have been crossing here for 1,000 years or more. I wonder what will be happening in 1,000 years' time. Probably something or someone will still be going across. Hope you've enjoyed our video. Please like it if you did. And if you want to know more, we publish a whole series of books about local history. The history of Nottinghamshire and the history of Lincolnshire. So please have a look at those as well and find out more about this fascinating region.